Run, don't walk. It's the SAP, and we're back, baby. Tonight's show is going to be explosive. Our guest this evening is Bruce Fenton. But before we get there, I want to thank all of you listeners, both old and new. A bit like a tree falling in the forest, this show would not exist without you, the magicians making the grass green. So please continue to comment, like, subscribe, and share. And as always, and most importantly, enjoy. So here we go. Bruce Fenton is an explorer best known for his expeditions to the megalithic constructions in the Ecuadorian Amazon jungle and ancient ruins in the Georgian Caucasus. His adventures have featured in the UK Telegraph and Daily Mail newspapers, as well as on the Science Channel. Most recently, he made several appearances on the flagship History Channel show Ancient Aliens. He has two books available for purchase, The Forgotten Exodus and Exogenesis. Hybrid Humans, a scientific history of extraterrestrial genetic manipulation, with a foreword by Eric von Daniken, no less. This is a book I've recently finished, and I loved it a lot, so I highly recommend it. Bruce also has a website, brucefenton.info. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Bruce. Thank you for your time. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, to both of you. And I look forward to having an interesting chat. Good stuff.
Great. So I'm going to hand things over to John to kick us off.
Hi, Bruce. Nice to meet you. We've been talking for quite a few years now. You're one of the first people I ever spoke to on UFO Twitter. Yep. And it turned out I found out you were then in Wales as well, which was even better for me.
Yep.
So let's talk us through your journey. How did you become an author? What caused your interest in this topic? That you've chosen to pursue, and what are you doing in Wales?
Yeah, I mean, my journey has been long and winding, I suppose. Really, when about 11 years old, I had, my grandmother used to get tea leaves, old-fashioned, box of tea leaves, and in them you would get these collectible cards. And I don't know if anyone of you guys have ever seen these, but it was many a year ago. I think it was PG, and at one point they had a series of mystery cards. I think it was 40 different unexplained mysteries. And so she used to give me these when I'd go around on a Sunday and see her. And it'd be everything from, the pyramids, Yetis, Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, the whole gamut, was really covered. Yeah, and that's actually where my interest began, to be honest, in all of these kind of ancient mysteries topics, UFOs, ghosts, all of that came just from, the happenstance of her giving me these cards. So it's kind of a funny way into it, and that's obviously derailed my life ever since. So there you go. but it's been quite a journey. I mean, obviously I didn't go straight from that to the work I'm doing now. Initially I had quite an interest in the paranormal, as well as the ancient mysteries of South American cultures, particularly the Maya, the Aztecs, Inca, and also Egypt, of course. I guess a lot of us have some kind of deep abiding, interest in ancient Egypt, and the pyramids and all those mysteries. So I've kind of moved from that though into certainly into the aliens topic, UFOs, and what I would call kind of anomalies of science. I have a general interest in anything that's just kind of pushing the boundaries, where there's some evidence, but we don't quite understand what's going on, obviously consciousness and the like. So it's become quite a broad, really broad research field for me. That's sort of how it's ended up now. Oh, Wales, I should just quickly say, sorry, I've moved now back to England, but I was in Wales for about 2 years. So
yeah.
I know. Yeah. With the lockdown and everything, I moved here closer to family and stuff. So I loved where I was on the coast though, near sort of Llanelli and that way. And it was beautiful. Yeah, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But unfortunately, back in England now, away from the sea.
Yeah, landlocked again. So, Bruce, I'm not quite sure how to start here. To put it plainly, I want to know what the fuck exactly you think happened 780,000 years ago. But let's get there in time. But I want to talk about tektites. But before we get to that, there's been a bit of TTSA and breaking news. There's been a bit of breaking news with TTSA and their CRADA. Have you got a question about that, John?
Yeah, so like you say, John Greenwald of the Black Vault seems to have confirmed that the metamaterials that were given over by the TTSA and the Adams Project to the Army and the CRADA, as predicted, have basically gone into the void, and we're never going to see the results. it's great. I mean, he's done great work, John Greenwald. If he's actually confirmed that now, it'd be nice if TTSA would come out with some comment on this. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a major disappointment for everyone, really, that's had an interest in that topic, because, I mean, the underlying premise, at least that we were given, was that TTSA would provide answers to these metamaterials and also would look at, bringing out sort of revolutionary technologies. I mean, I think we've all abandoned hope that there's going to be any revolutionary technologies, but that there still had been, some expectation we would at least get some basic data out of these materials that, suppose they collected quite a lot of different pieces, from what we were told, but it really doesn't sound like we're going to find out much about any of them. So I would expect everyone is disappointed.
Yeah, I mean, they seem to have gone around all over the country in America and basically hoovered up any samples that anyone had. I'd like to know the real reasons why they did that. They got people to sign NDAs. So they can't talk about what they gave over. They can't say what they've been told, if they've been any testing at all. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I do speak with Hal Putoff, so I will be dropping him a message on this when I get a chance. So I'll let the community know if I find anything out. So let's get on to tektites then, Dave.
So Bruce, what are tektites and where do they come from?
Question. Yeah, that's a good question. So tektites are a type of glass. I mean, at the very most basic, they're a type of glass. They are found in basically 5 major strewn fields, it's called. It's basically a collection of material that's very similar, spread out across a region. So there's 5 of these strewn fields. The most famous one is actually the Moldavite strewn field, and I think probably most listeners will be sort of semi-familiar with Moldavite, this greenish kind of translucent gemstone it's particularly well known in the kind of the occult fields, and crystal healing and stuff, because it's associated with apparently very strong reactions that people say, I've read that people say they hold it and they have also very strong reactions, or they see things, so it's become quite famous in the occult. Now that's just one of them. That's from the Moldova sort of region, so that's hence the name Moldavites. There's also another strewn field that we've got in North America, where we have what's called the Georgiasites, and another one down in the Ivory Coast tektites, and what we're going to talk about, of course, the australites, which is the biggest one. And then there's a very small strewn field that's been found in Central America, which is still, I think, under some debate as to whether it's a true strewn field. But there's only 5 of them in the world. Now, the current sort of popular consensus view is that they are associated with impacts. So you might think they should just be called impact glasses, but there is an issue as to why they're sort of segregated off as tektites, and that's because if we look at the many examples of definitive impact glasses, we find some crucial differences in terms of their appearance, their chemical makeup. Just to give the most basic, if you have something that impacts from space, you have an asteroid, comet, whatever it is, you get a very quick blast of energy, extreme heating, extreme pressure, and that of course will melt the local rock. It will throw some rock to quite a distance. Usually the limit is around about 400 kilometers. Typically you find most of the material is within 400 kilometers of an impact, and this material will be firstly extraordinarily close in terms of chemical makeup to the crater itself, and the rocks in the crater. Now that makes a lot of sense because, of course, it's made out of those rocks. Now, the second thing you'll notice in them is that they are very frothy, and that is that they have a lot of bubbles in them because it's happening very fast. There's a quick heating, quick cooling. So any gases and air in it, that sort of remains in there as it cools. It takes a bit longer for bubbles to leave a viscous liquid. Now, and the other thing you find with these as well is that there is part melt. So, you get pieces of rock or sand or even organic debris that is trapped inside that glass. So there's a few really sort of glaring things there that will distinguish tektites, because when we look at tektite glasses, these are instead extraordinarily well mixed. That's called sort of homogeneous. There's no signs of the melted apart melt or generally organic inclusions, sands, anything like that. It's just a very well mixed type of glass. It's also very homogeneous across all the different pieces. So if you compare 2 pieces, normally they are extremely similar to each other chemically and in their morphology, the appearance, again, which is unlike the other impact glasses. They have very little water as well, almost no water at all, which is unusual because all Earth rocks and stuff have quite a bit of water in them. And the what I'm looking for here. So we've got, so there's no the bubbles. Sorry, I've got these bubbles. Those have all gone. Basically, it's quite rare to find. You find sometimes one small bubble or something in a piece, but not this frothy kind of look that we see in impact glasses. And again, if you compare impact glasses to nuclear blast glass, which I'm sure some people will be familiar with, that we have from the nuclear test sites, that we have this material again, which is very foamy and frothy, full of bubbles. It's got part melt. So because that happens in the same kind of way as an impact, you have a very brief, high energy event, a lot of pressure, a lot of heat, and that transforms the sand, into glasses. So you can put a kind of an impact glass next to a nuclear melt glass, and you can see that they've formed in a very, very similar process, and yet very unlike tektites. So that's at its most basic. Now, so I'll hand it back to you, just so people an idea of what they are.
Yeah. So is there a major difference between tektites and australite tektites? And obviously, there's the lack of impact crater, but is there a big difference in their chemical composition to other tektites found around the world?
And their shape. Is the shape different?
Yes, so there's some crucial differences. Each one of the strewn fields has some differences to the others. So there's some chemical composition differences, obviously size differences. I mean, for a start, the australite tektite strewn field is vast. It stretches all the way from southern China down to Antarctica. So it's over 10,000 kilometers of material. So, I mean, absolutely enormous. I think the last calculation I saw is that something like 20% of the Earth's surface has some level of australite tektite found on it. So, if you think about that, so they stretches out as far as Madagascar in the west, across past Papua New Guinea out into the ocean to the east, and then all the way from China to Antarctica. So it's an enormous segment of the planet where they found either the larger tektites or what's called micro tektites, which are under a millimeter across, and that those are found often in sort of ocean core samples and so. So that's an enormous strewn field. There's none other like it. But they also, there are chemical differences and there are isotopic differences and stuff between these strewn fields. So although we know that there's fundamental similarities because of the homogeneity and this kind of mixing and other elements of it that broadly puts them all into this a category of tektites, that each strewn field has differences. Now, the other point to make is that although three of these tektite strewn fields have been linked to crater sites, but not definitively. Again, there's questions around all of these strewn fields. So although I don't focus particularly on them, I have a personal suspicion that we need to rethink the entire field of tektites, not just australites, because in all these cases, if we look at where they're not found in the crater itself for a start. So you don't have that kind of definitive thing when you say, okay, well, we've got the part melt created, crater rock in them, and that they're made exactly the same material as the crater. So there's really questions there as to whether any of them should be linked to these crater sites. But the australite tektite field is particularly anomalous in that there is no crater that has been established as being even sort of viable as a possible impact site for it, right? So we have this extraordinary problem that we have an enormous tektite strewn field, absolutely vast, which you'd expect then a very clear crater, and also an enormous crater, quite frankly, because you're talking about an astonishing weight of material, right? It's covered, right across Southeast Asia. So we're talking about an enormous amount of debris. You'd also talk about fairly young, because the dating on it, the best dating at the moment is 788,000 years old. So that's fairly young in geographic terms, right? In geological terms, sorry. Whereas a lot of the others are older. I think Moldavite is maybe tens of millions or 100 million years old or something. So when we get to this kind of age, so under 1 million years, you'd expect this crater to be quite evident. Yeah. And even if it's under the sea, we do detect craters under the sea as anomalies and stuff. So they wouldn't be completely hidden. It's very young. Right. So there's been a lot of searching for a potential impact site, and that's led to, suggestions, but none of which have been chosen as being, convincing. Most recently, there was a study which I think it's still ongoing, but they'd found what might be some kind of anomaly under a lava plateau in Laos. And a few people sort of raised that to me and said, well, does that solve it? Well, there's a few problems with it. First of all, that it's under a lava field. So they need to drill. They need to see if it really is even a crater, this anomaly. Also, they have the issue that it's quite small. I think it was about sort of 15 kilometers across or something. And the best estimates I've seen for a crater that could, in theory, produce the amount of debris we're talking about, has to be something like 40 to 100 kilometers across. Right.
Is this the argument then, Bruce, that some of these are coming from volcanoes, and some of these are, produced by volcanoes, and you're saying, and others are saying that these are coming from space, and so they must be impact craters?
Well, on the volcano part, I mean, if we go back to the 30s and 40s, right? NASA was involved in looking into NASA scientists and engineers took a particular interest in tektites, and they felt that it was very likely that they could have been volcanic glasses dislodged from the moon that had been sent across, jettisoned across to Earth. And the reason why they associate them is, if we look at volcanic glass, it's very similar in many ways to tektites. Again, you have this kind of homogeneity. When people say homogeneity, I mean that all of the different chemicals are very well mixed. So say if you had 3 or 4 kinds of rock that were melted, right, you have time mixing them in a caldera, obviously if we see with lava, they become very well mixed, and that's called homogeneous materials, right, because it's all stirred away in that superheating until it's pretty much chemically alike right across the body of liquid, right? So we have that homogeneity in calderas when we have lava forming. So this is kind of why they associate it. They thought, well, hang on, it looks like the same kind of process where you have a crucible, you have a long period of heating so that this glass becomes well mixed. It also bubbles out all of the gases, and that's where you end up with these kind of homogeneous, very well mixed, low bubble glasses from volcanic events, right? So it seemed quite logical to a lot of the NASA guys that this had to be a kind of a volcanic glass. So they were looking at, well, hang on, where can this have come from? Because we know that volcanoes on Earth basically can't throw material to the kind of distances we're talking about, right? So if you've got a massive eruption, it's not going to propel material in ballistic trajectories 10,000 kilometers, right? It's impossible for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons we cover that as well, because if anyone's sort of thinking, well, why is that? And why isn't it that a conventional impact could do that? And the simple answer is that, no matter how fast something is dislodged from the surface of the Earth, so even if you have a comet or whatever it is, no matter how fast those pieces of debris travel, the air ahead of them becomes more compressed the faster it's traveling. And so it's meeting higher and higher resistance, okay? And to the point where it equalizes the amount of resistance ahead to the force, the force propelling it, and it will just fall, right? So in other words, the faster it's going, it's actually compressing the air quicker. So it kind of balances it back out. And so it shouldn't be able to propel it for more than about 1,000 kilometers. Usually it's about 400 kilometers that we see around these impact sites. But the furthest from what I've read is about 1,000 that can in theory travel. Beyond that, you're dealing with an absolute kind of physical limits where you just can't do this, right? And in fact, the lower the angle as well, the quicker this happens, because the atmosphere is denser, the lower down you go, right? The further up, obviously, it becomes less dense. So if it's at a shallow angle, and you'd want a shallow angle for the maximum distance, because of course an obtuse angle going up like that, you're going to have to go a very long way to end up 10,000 kilometers, right? So it's assumed that these are projecting out at shallow angles. So they're actually meeting higher resistance in that lower atmosphere. So again, it's fully accepted by the mainstream academics that you cannot explain the travel of australite tektites, or in fact, any tektite that travels this kind of distance. I mean, the other sides, they're not as far. But so if you have this vast distance, it cannot be the result of the normal actions of an impact of just throwing material through the air and it landing 10,000 kilometers away. And that's
you mentioned the moon as well, then, Bruce. I noticed. So I remember I mean, it's quite a long time since we spoke about this, but I think it was Hal Pulvermeyer that actually mapped the moon, and he was really into tektites as well, as from what I remember.
Yeah.
So where does the moon fit into your hypothesis on this then? How are they on the moon if there are no volcanoes on the moon?
Well, yeah, I'll backtrack a bit to the moon V. So so we had a number of NASA scientists who concluded that the most likely scenario was an asteroid traveling through space impacted the moon, and that it hit some volcanoes on the moon, and there are supposedly extinct volcanoes on the moon, right?
On the front of the moon.
So it would have been, so it would have been on the moon side facing us. But at the time when this was theorized, they believed that there might still be some volcanic activity on the moon. So keep in mind, we're doing the 30s and 40s, right? So they weren't that really, up to speed on lunar geology, right? So there was this belief that there could still be some active volcanic sites on the moon. So they thought perhaps this object had hit one of these lunar volcanoes and had dislodged volcanic glass and thrown it out into space, either as a sort of a small tight swarm or as a chunk of glass, which had traveled across to Earth and then had kind of broken up, coming in in a kind of orbital path, had broken up and had kind of just showered this material across Southeast Asia, right? And so this was one of the kind of the strongest hypotheses at the time. Now they were arguing that the other alternative to that, and this is mostly NASA guys arguing against non-NASA scientists, and on the other side of it, with the academics in the unis and what they were arguing, that this was a conventional impact on Earth. There was a point where there was some arguing over whether it could have been a volcano on the moon or a volcano on Earth just exploding, but both of those were kind of discounted for some of the reasons we tackled earlier. So what they were left with were these two hypotheses of impacts either on the moon or on Earth. Now, each one of those hypotheses explains a whole range of areas of evidence, right? But not all of them. And conversely, each argument had some positives and negatives that the other didn't. Right. So this is why you end up with a kind of a slugging match instead of just someone winning, because they'd say, well, look, you can't explain the homogeneity and, and the mixing. And the others say, well, you can't really explain, some of the chemical makeup. Right. So that was going on for years. And then when we finally got lunar rock samples and analyzed them, it became obvious that these tektites couldn't be made from lunar rock. And also we began to understand that there was no signs of current or even recent lunar activity. It seemed to have, in terms of any sort of live volcanoes, that was too long ago, basically, to explain tektites 788,000 years. It just didn't mesh at all, right? So what happened there was you had the kind of the capitulation of the NASA scientists saying, well, look, okay, so it's not, a volcano on the moon. It's not an impact on the moon. We kind of give up. And I think for the most part, nearly all of them did kind of throw in the towel on that. But they said, well, hang on, if you guys are saying it's an impact on Earth, you need to explain all these other anomalies in it, right? You don't get to just win because the other guy loses. And I always sort of compare this as if you think of it as a boxing match, right, where there's two guys are kind of slugging it out, and then one guy just drops dead from a heart attack, right? So the other guy wins. But did he win because of his amazing fighting style, right? Or did he just win by the default that the other guy died, right? So that doesn't make him, in my view, the better fighter, right? Because it was just chance event. So in this case, it's similar to that. They didn't explain the evidence better. It's just that the NASA guy's hypothesis collapsed upon finding this material was inconsistent. So what happened is we've ended up with this popular consensus that it's all explained by this impact. And yet, if you look in the papers, and there's hundreds of papers on this, you find that there's a general agreement that this is still a mystery, that after 160 years of scientific investigation of the tektites, that there remains this mystery, particularly around the australites, as to how they were formed, how they can be so well mixed with, how they can be so homogeneous, and also, as you touched on earlier, the shaping of some of them, particularly the australite tektites. We have these button tektites.
I'll show you a picture. So this is just the button type, yeah?
Yeah. And it's very distinctive.
This one as well, the top bit.
And this shows you that these aren't, although they look black, obviously with the light behind it, you see they are translucent crystal. Not crystal, sorry, I'd say glass. So they are glasses largely formed, they believe, from melted quartz crystal, but also has a number of metals in there. There's about 10% aluminium, around 75% silica from quartz, 10% aluminium, and then a range of other lesser metals and chemicals in there, right? So with these button tektites, obviously you can see that they've been shaped by aerodynamic forces. And that was one of the reasons why the NASA guys were particularly interested, because you can see it's almost like a nose cone of a rocket, right? It's very obvious to them that they were dealing with something that had passed through the atmosphere. And so it had a sort of special interest. And so they took glass spheres and they tested them in the NASA Ames research lab to see what kind of forces would turn a glass sphere into one of these buttons, right? And so they essentially concluded that it would have to be coming into the atmosphere at a very gentle, very sort of, almost horizontal to the plane of the Earth, kind of gentle angle, essentially an orbital path, and that as it grazed the upper atmosphere, it bounced along. And they can see that in some of the way the bubbles have kind of formed and popped. And then it came in and started to heat on the front edge, and that liquid glass then moved to the back, and you've got this shape where you can see the back part of the original sphere is at the back of the button. And so it forms almost like a heat shield at the front, and then you've got the cool second half of the sphere at the back. So they know they came in as solid, cold, spherical glass bodies, which had already formed from some parent object which had been superheated, and that then they've come in, had secondary melting to form these buttons. And then as they've eventually they've come through the atmosphere and they've fallen primarily in southern Australia, the tektite buttons. Although the strewn field is vast, the buttons are fairly limited to southern Australia and to parts of, I believe, of Java. And that's it. So you've got some up in Southeast Asia and most of them down in southern Australia, right? But again, and there's some clues there that we're dealing with something strange, because if you look where those two sites are, there's kind of a huge gap, right? And there you've got this vast strewn field. Why aren't there buttons all along it, right? So that we can sort of come to. But so they had this glaring anomaly. They're like, well, hang on a minute. First of all, we have to have had an explanation for a parent body that has been superheated, turned to liquid, and has formed spheres which are now coming in from space. So they were thinking, well, hang on a minute, we can't really conceive of an impact that froze a giant blob of molten glass up from the Earth's surface, because apart from anything else, we have no material on Earth that would just turn into a giant blob of glass like that in terms of the chemical composition. But also it has to get all the way up through the atmosphere and into space, right? And it still has to be super hot, and then has to pull apart into all these spheres. So there's some really sort of glaring absurdities in that. So they thought, well, it looks more like something that has exploded in space, because we know liquid will pool into a sphere in vacuum, right? So we can, anyone who's watched any NASA shows, that water floating around in the spacecraft, you can see those little droplets of spheres, right? So if we have a liquid in space, it will form spherical forms. So they were, okay, well, this is what's happened. We have these drops of liquid glass that have rapidly cooled and formed these spheres. And it was so quick, that's why we don't find actual crystals. It takes a crystallization process that takes a bit of time. So you think the glass was molten and then it was frozen. And again, that matches with an explosion in vacuum, right? And then these spheres are coming in at these very gentle angles. And so they deduced the parent body was almost certainly in orbit, because what we're seeing here is the decaying parts of a larger orbiting body that have continued along those orbital paths of the parent and have gradually come in through the Earth's upper atmosphere in the way almost like an exploding space station would do so. You can imagine it keep going around, but pieces start to come in at gentle angles, very shallow, hitting the atmosphere, bouncing a bit, and then they've come in and melted. Right? So that's quite unlike something that is supposedly being thrown up, right? So in other words, it seems to be coming in from space. And that's why they were very much set on the idea that this had to be coming from the moon, because there really isn't, there's not a lot of options for them in a way, because if you have, let's say, an object, an asteroid coming in from space, it will generally, they come in at fairly steep angles, right? If they come in at shallow angles, they often just pass us by. They bounce off the atmosphere and they go off into space, right? And they're going at extreme speeds. So, that's usually what will happen if they're going at a horizontal to the plane of the Earth. They'll just bounce off, or maybe they're small enough, break up there. If they're coming in at an angle where they're going to head towards the surface, they come in so fast that what you see instead is a melting of the first layer, but it's so rapid it evaporates away. So it just becomes liquid and evaporates away, and a cool core hits the earth. And that's why if you find a meteorite on the ground, you can see that there's very little signs actually of it being melted on most of the stone. Okay, because that has just evaporated away. So they know that it has to come in at these shallow angles, and they think the speed was probably just under the speed required to leave Earth's gravity. It's about 14.4 kilometers a second. So it has to be a bit less than that. They think maybe 10. And so this is not consistent with something coming directly in from from distant space, and it's also not consistent with something not being thrown up. Which again, you've got a whole lot of problems with something traveling up, sort of over 100 kilometers straight up into the air, and then coming back in at these angles and at these colossal speeds, right? So that's another whole set of problems. And just to clarify that again, a lot of this is, as you can appreciate, there's some somewhat complex arguments that have to be made. So when the conventional argument is made for this, they say, okay, well, we know that this cannot be as simple as an impact that just froze things, through the air for 10,000 kilometers. We know it can't be that. So how do we explain this glass flying up into space and then coming back in all the way down to Antarctica? And at the moment, there's a couple of sort of arguments. That the main one is that could it be that this object, this parent body, has come in from space, maybe like huge asteroid, and it has come in and it's punched a hole through the atmosphere, displacing the air and forming a vacuum, sort of almost like a vacuum chamber. And it's hit the Earth, and above it is vacuum. And then in the explosion, you've got almost like a plasma storm, which is then throwing this material up into the air through vacuum. So not into the air, technically, into the vacuum. And that this material is then flying straight up through vacuum into space, right? And that would allow potentially material to then exit the Earth, maybe some of it to come back down somewhere. But it leaves you with a whole range of questions, because one of the scientists pointed out that this type of object would be something like comparable to the body that caused the Chicxulub crater and the eradication of the dinosaurs, right? So if you get something on that scale, but it said that should leave the crater something like the size of Ireland, right? So that's going to be hard to miss. Like they say, a young crater. So it had to be somewhere in Southeast Asia, because their argument is, well, look, we find huge chunks of material there, up to 25 kilos, right, called Muong Nong tektite, which is part of the strewn field. 25 kilos, those chunks. So they say, well, that can't have gone far from an impact. A 25 kilo block, right, of glass. Yeah. How far is that going to have gone? So they say that has to be the impact site, really. And yet there's no sign of a crater. Okay, and Muong Nong tektite is a whole other level of weirdness. It's a kind of a layered, molten-looking, pooling type of tektite. It's quite strange in chunks. So they cut through, and you can see all these layers. So, and also you find in that area the other kinds of australite, the other kinds of tektites. You have the not only the, say in Java, the button tektites, but also you have dumbbell shapes, you have teardrop shapes, you have disc shapes. And also I think spears, right? So they come in a range, and around Southeast Asia, you've got several of those types. So they say it has to have been somewhere there, yet there's no sign of this crater. And also you think, there's another problem. If it's displaced all of this air, and you've got this crazy event, plasma storms, and all stuff, that you're going to expect there to be a massive impact on life, right, in that area. I mean, and if it's displacing so much vacuum that material is being thrown for thousands of kilometers. I mean, how big is this vacuum chamber, right? How big is this? Is it the size of Australasia? I mean, it starts getting to sort of a point where you say, well, how has life seemingly been unaffected across Southeast Asia and Australasia from what should be an impact on the scale of the impact that killed the dinosaurs, and it doesn't seem to even register for organisms? I mean, it stretches credulity, and they found that these large chunks of Muong Nong are found up to several thousand kilometers separate. So I said, well, you can't have an impact site that stretches across, over 1,000 kilometers. I mean, that's enormous, right? So it's what's going on here. So although they've given that as a kind of a possibility, it very quickly starts to look absurd, right? And the other thing you have to look at is when we had the impact that caused the, well, again, allegedly caused the eradication of the dinosaurs, we accept that that's what happened. There's a dust is thrown up everywhere, right? So you've got this massive impact. The dust goes up into the upper atmosphere and that circulates. There's not just material that goes out. And it's quite possible that, yes, some rocks maybe were thrown out by that impact and they went out into space and they could have gone off to Mars or whatever, right? Because we know that sometimes Earth and Mars have exchanged material. We found Martian meteorites and we believe there's probably terrestrial meteorites on Mars. So that can happen in major impacts, right? But also you get a lot of dust and that dust goes up into the upper atmosphere. It swirls around the planet. And then, of course, it rains back down, and you end up with a dust layer in the geologic record. You know, like we have the K2 barrier, right, for the Chicxulub event, and you find that all around the world. You find the iridium layer, and you find a dust layer. Right? So, where's the one for the giant impact in Southeast Asia? Turns out that's totally missing. That in those core samples where we find the microtektites, there is no sign of a dust layer, right? So what's going on there then? Because how can we have such a mega event that it's busted a hole in our atmosphere and thrown rocks into space and, you know, chunks going 10,000 kilometers, but there's no dust? No dust is thrown up by this?
That's a great explanation on that. Thanks, Bruce. You got to crack on with these questions then, Dave, because we got quite
well, no, I was wondering, are there any myths from Southeast Asia or Aboriginal myths regarding, say, like a shower of glass or crystal coming down from the sky, and is there overlap between their myths?
Yeah, there is actually. It was interesting that when Western science first kind of started to get interested in the australite tektites, you know, they were arguing over whether or not these were like volcanic, whether or not they were maybe even a lost technology, like in Aboriginal glass technology, but the Aboriginal people that they spoke to said, actually, no, they came from outer space and that they showered across Australia, you know. So it's kind of funny that, you know, they seem to be ahead of the game and were quite insistent that these were extraterrestrial. And also there is accounts of it being linked to, say, the Icemen, that these beings called the Icemen had showered them down whilst trying to destroy the ring-tailed possum people. So that there was an event, and so there had been these Icemen, and there's other legends of these Icemen, and I find that's quite funny because if you look into claims of contact experiences people have, one of the types of beings are these kind of bluish white, tall humanoid beings who I would say is kind of ice, you know, like ice blue. Talk of that color, you know, a bit not quite white, not quite blue, but somewhere that kind of color. These Icemen, and again we have these legends of the tall whites or the tall blues. Right, which anyone familiar with kind of, you know, obviously the ufology and contact mythology will be familiar with that. Now, those seem to be pretty apt in terms of the same type of entity, these Icemen. So we have this link that supposedly the Icemen are connected to the tektites. Also, that these are seen as sacred objects, and they're used they're also been carried in like a dilly bag by a clever fella, which is like a sort of shamanic practitioner, right, in the indigenous Australasian traditions, and that they were seen as either being able to use to heal or to harm, and also it'd be quite common for when a new clever fella gives his powers. Sometimes they're taken up into the sky realms, right? So they have an experience. They're taken up in the sky realms, and they will have crystals and australite tektites put into their bodies to give them their powers. And that's some of the experiences they report, is that they are filled with these crystals and australites. And that's interesting because you see in South America, there's accounts of being taken up and be filled with crystals. But in Australasia, it's also with these tektites. And so they are seen as power objects, not just as random stones, you know, lying around the floor. So, yeah, there is legends that go with them, which I find is quite fascinating. And
me too. So do you have a theory for where these australite tektites have come from?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the first thing is, again, if we look at the core component of it, which is the silica, right? So it's over 75% silica. Now that's very telling because natural asteroids and comets and all the rest have never been found to have more than 60% silica. Right, so you have an abnormally high rate of silica in there, apart from 10% aluminium and a lot of other metals, which are interesting. But that stands out to me because we know that we are supposedly, if you look at the cutting edge of SETI, we are supposedly looking for alien techno-signatures, right? Now, one of the things that we are told that we should be looking for is post-biological silica life, or post-biological silica kind of probes, AI living probes, basically, which are called Bracewell probes. Now, these would be highly silica, because essentially they are what large silica networks is what we're developing. You know, we use silica in our technologies, silica chips, and it's theorized that, you know, you could send out an AI probe that explores the cosmos for you and is kind of loaded with AI, you know, so it can kind of do the mission for you. Now, that is what I think we are looking at. I think we are looking at here is a technology of that type, you know, that was in orbit, was destroyed in orbit, and then we have these pieces raining down exactly as we would expect from an object that has exploded in orbit. So what is it doing there? You know, what is this object doing in orbit? Why is there this anomalous object, 75% silica and other metals, that seems to be circling our planet, right? And then somehow explodes, which in itself is kind of anomalous. And then we have it raining down, you know, for 10,000 kilometers. I think the only object that we know of, because we don't know anything in natural. So you start off with all the natural things, right? So you whittle those away. Now, keep in mind that there's been 160 years of research into australite tektites. I think that's long enough to say there's been a fair crack at it, right? In terms of explaining it away in you know, normal terms. Compare it for a moment to Oumuamua, right, where we have this object which was anomalous, you know, had anomalous reflectivity, anomalous shape. It, you know, it did a few things that were strange, like it passed through the plane of the solar system right between Mars and Earth, which are the only habitable, you know, planets, essentially. Did a few other things that were strange. Now, obviously, there's still argument going over that, but within 3 years, it'd been proposed that might be an alien probe. Right, so you sort of think about that within 3 years. Now, I think 160 years is plenty of time to say maybe we need to go a bit further than natural objects, because if we can't explain it with natural objects, then we have to look at unnatural. And then we're told we're supposed to be looking for these techno-signatures. We're supposed to be searching for them, right? And then we have an object that is made of the very material that we expect to see in a Bracewell probe of some type, right? And so this thing is circling our planet, right? So there's a point you have to say, well, hang on a minute. If we don't look at that as a potential techno-signature, what would one be? You know, what is it we're looking for?
What do you need? Yeah,
what do you need? Because we're told that these things is what we're going to look for. And, you know, these are the kind of behaviors we expect. If an object passing between Earth and Mars is interesting, you know, and an object, and it has strange reflectivity suggesting it's made up of maybe of something unusual, if that all leads, you know, a top astronomer to say it could be an alien probe, then what about a vast silica body that is just orbiting our planet, right? As though monitoring us, yeah, made of the very stuff we expect to see in it, and beyond the natural limits of any natural body that we know of, right? And again, if it's from quartz doesn't even form on these objects. Quartz is found on planetary bodies, right? So if it was really silica from melted quartz, you have a real problem there, because it shouldn't be there at all in an asteroid. And on top of that, you have the fact that, you know, it's, again, linked to a period of time which is interesting, which we can come to. There's a lot of other things going on at that time. But so I would argue that, yeah, that we are dealing with a very glaring sort of marker for a techno-signature. Now, I wouldn't go to the point of saying, look, okay, it's 100%, because, you know, the only way you can get to 100% in anything is really hard, okay, for a start. You know, to say absolutely, it's definitely that, it's proven, and yeah, because we can always argue, you know, that well, you know, maybe there is scenario X, no matter how convoluted that scenario might be, that could explain something, right? So let's say that somewhere out there is a planet that has been, you know, exploded. It had a lot of quartz on it, and that quartz was melted, somehow ended up in a large quartz body flying through the galaxy, right? And it happens to come through our solar system, just happens to get pulled into an orbit around Earth, you know, and then somehow explode. So you could say, look, you could come up with some convoluted scenario which might account for it, right? So I'm always saying it's not 100%, but you can say, okay, on the balance of possibilities and evidence, which one is most likely, right? And because we don't know of any such bodies like that, and because it takes a whole load of unlikely scenarios, right, including the fact that somehow capturing such an object, Earth doesn't tend to capture large bodies. If you look at it, we have small asteroids, like bus-sized asteroids, that are captured and circle the planet sometimes, right? This would be something kilometers across. So we're not talking about a small object. This is something big, right? So this would be quite extraordinary that we would capture, even that we would capture a body of that size, that body would happen to be made of entirely anomalous components, right? Again, and probably a homogeneous glassy object. So, it's like a basically big chunk of glass flying through space. So that in itself is extraordinary, that it would end up in Earth orbit. Again, you're starting to put those, what's the million to one to the 10 million to one to the, to the billion to, right? So I wouldn't say that, okay, nobody could come up with something else. That's the best one I've come up with in terms of, could it be something else? So other than that, then I would say then, yes, the only other explanation is this techno-signature, because the conventional arguments has, after 160 years, have not been able to come up with a coherent explanation for the phenomena and for the forces involved in its formation and its distribution.
And to me, that's fascinating. It really is. And I hope the work continues. So to change topics just slightly here, what's the best evidence that our DNA has been tampered with or modified? Sure. And how do you go about dating such a thing? And correct me if I'm wrong here, but in the book, you say that this meddling only happened once to a common ancestor. Is that true? Is that what you say? I can't help but think of the 2001 monolith when I heard that.
I mentioned that briefly in the book, because there was definitely parallels with with 2001. I mean, part of that, you got this black glassy material, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it was hard not to think, God, were they sort of, in the know on this or something? Because it's just so strange that you've got them, these two guys who are well-connected guys writing about this black kind of glassy material that is associated with the origins of Homo sapiens and some kind of AI technology, that we are led to think of these as basically as a kind of Bracewell probes, what we call a sentinel probe. And if you want to look that up, it's sentinel probes. The idea of a sentinel probe is that an advanced extraterrestrial race might want to send out its, exploring probes across the galaxy, but it may also sit some of them on planetary surfaces to monitor, or on moons or on asteroids or whatever, monitoring a planet to see if it develops life. And if that life develops to a certain point, a sentinel probe could be programmed so that it will activate and make contact with a civilization and essentially act as the ambassador to that far off, civilization. Now that's what we're looking at really in terms of 2001. It's a kind of a Bracewell probe, but interactive, because of course it's actually modifying the species in some way as well as monitoring it. Yeah. Now that's very similar to what we're talking about in my work, that there is, a presence, an object, which I suggest is an advanced AI, and that is connected to human origins. Now, the timing is quite amazing, because we have this body exploding around 788,000 years ago. And up until about probably 5-6 years ago, well, probably around that 5 years ago, it was generally thought that ourselves, modern humans and our Homo sapien ancestors had kind of split away from more primitive archaic hominins, perhaps 400 or 500,000 years ago. And then we'd split from Neanderthals somewhere in the 400,000 odd years ago. And then, 200,000 years ago, we become what we call now Homo sapiens, or early archaic Homo sapiens. Now, that's all been sort of revolutionized since then, because there's a few reasons, but we found the evidence of Denisovans, another cousin species. So we've managed to accrue a lot of DNA evidence from Neanderthals, from Denisovans, also from unknown ghost populations where we have DNA, but we don't have fossils, but found in the genome of archaic hominins. And we also got some of the oldest human DNA, which was found at the Cima de los Huesos site, which is basically the pit of bones in Spain. And we managed to extract DNA from archaic hominins there, which I think it's about 460,000 years old or something, if I remember rightly. But, very old, the oldest that we've ever recovered. And that pointed to a much earlier split. And in fact, that Neanderthals had branched off away from us perhaps 500 or 600,000 years ago. And that the archaic hominins that gave rise to us, Denisovans, Neanderthals, probably lived something like 800,000 years ago. Right. And so the split began to happen a little bit after that gives rise to all of the large brained humans And again, you got to remember, we all interbreed. Neanderthals, Denisovans, us can all interbreed. We're all off one branch from the super archaic hominins like Homo erectus and stuff, right? That we've branched away from them, and we all have these capabilities, this amazing brain. We'll go on to do art, science, communication. We're very similar. We now understand we were very similar, and we interbred, right? So we have some sort of mysterious origin shared with them around that time. So now we're talking about that. Hang on a minute. So it just so happens that our origins of our lineage go back to around the same time that this object is flying around our planet, right? So that itself is odd. And then it turns out there's a few other things going on at the same time, because we also have the last geomagnetic reversal on this planet is dated to around 780,000 years ago. So that's a full reversal of the Earth's field occurs around the same time again. What else happens? We have an impact in Antarctica and there's a number of anomalies detected there, which they think was a huge object, maybe the size of the one that eradicated the dinosaurs. So another enormous body that broke up into about 5 pieces, hit the ice, and one of them left an initial hole in the ice 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers, so absolutely vast, right? And the only reason that this didn't cause the kind of level of destruction that we would see normally is because of the ice and the sea ice at the time, because it's hitting the ice, and the sea ice was much thicker because it was during an ice age, right? So that absorbed most of the energy. So we didn't get the same levels of tsunamis, fire and all the rest of it that you'd have if it hit land. So, but still, this is an enormous object. And then the last one of the things I find from that period, which is amazing, is that the planet was hit from multiple sides by asteroids dated to around 780 to 790,000 years ago, hitting in one in Central America, one in Tasmania, somewhere in Asia, and I think maybe even in America. They had about 4 objects or something that have hit the planet right at once. Now, that's super weird, right? Because every so many 100,000 years, a large object hits Earth, right? And that's normally how it works. You don't get like 4 or 5 of them. Or now, look, maybe 6, as you say. If we're supposedly having one that's formed the tektites, now we're told there's another massive one, maybe a similar size, that's hit Antarctica, and at the same time 3 or 4 others have hit the sides of the planet. It's like, what is going on here? Because the last time any sort of thing like that would happen would be in what's called the late heavy bombardment, basically at the beginning of the formation of our solar system, when there was loads of material flying around, right? After that, these are rare, these kind of large impacts. And when they looked closer into that impact, they found that it wasn't one object breaking up, because at the different sites, there's a different chemical composition. So you're talking about unique asteroids, right? They're all hitting us at the same time. So you've now got like 5 major geological anomalous things, right, happening in concordance and right at the beginning of the human story in terms of Homo sapiens, right? So just to put that in to preface a little bit to where we're going with this. So we know there's a lot of weird stuff going on, put it that way. There's a lot of weird stuff going on, and we now know it happens to time with our beginnings. So if you look at Homo sapiens, what really points to us being odd, there's a few things. I mean, the very basic level is that we are not very genetically diverse. Like if we compare us to other species, other mammals, and so that, over a vast period of time, a species accrues lots of variation, different groups break off and they become very different and subspeciate into different subspecies. Humans are very similar. In fact, if you compare any 2 humans, there's something like 0.1% difference in the genome or something, right? It's really small. In fact, there's more genetic variation in one group of chimps in Africa than in all humans on Earth. Right? Wow. You think about that. That's like, it's kind of mind-bending. So they know there's something odd, right, about our genetic origin. But then if you look closer, you think also, what makes us different from all the other primates? And there's a few things. The first ones is that, of course, obviously we have the brain. Now, but if you look to see what gave us that brain, you find that there's hundreds of different, well, probably more like thousands, there's hundreds of different genetic changes that relate to our brain that are only seen in us and not in any of the other primates, right? So now think of that in terms of random mutation, right, and evolution shaped by the environment. So we have this kind of feedback loop that was supposed to be, most of our evolution is supposed to be the product of random mutation, adaptation to environment. But hang on a minute, if most of this is in the brain, is brain genes, that's not very random, That's not random at all. In fact, that's hyper specific, isn't it? It's just nearly all of it's the brain. And one of the other things, when you look at us, you look at, say, chimps, and you look at other, orangutans, and you look at us, and people say, well, we don't look anything like them. Oh, so different. How can people say that it was only a tiny difference? But actually, if you look at an infant chimp and you look at it and compare it to a human being, it's actually very similar. Because at that point, they haven't developed the thick hair, they haven't got the protruding jaw, the face structure is very similar. We are basically an ape stuck in its kind of infant stage. And this is kind of really interesting, because you look at, there's a number of benefits to being stuck in an infant phase, right? And it's called, I can't think of the name's gone now, but there's a proper term for this. But basically, when an animal is young, right, it does a lot of play, it does a lot of learning, it's very flexible. Now, if you look at most other animal species, the adults don't play a lot, and they become hyper kind of talented in one thing. Let's say it's collecting fruit from a specific tree, or whatever it is, but they sort of specialize into one thing, and that becomes what they're really good at. But infants play a lot, and they're very flexible. Now, because we are stuck as a kind of an infant, not only do adults in our species do a lot of play, like we love sports and computer games, or we love playing like we're kids, but it also gives you the mental dexterity and flexibility to learn a wide range of skills and to reskill and adapt to new things. So being kind of shunted into a permanent childhood comes with a lot of benefits, and this is one of the things that makes humans unique. Now, also, if you can contrast us at the genetic level, you find there's a few other things. Well, there's some good and bad things. On the good side of it, obviously with the brain, we find that there's a range of anomalies in areas that's called human accelerated regions, right? Human accelerated regions are, I think, a really fascinating mystery in and of themselves. And this is where, going back a few years ago, there was the first detection of one of these. And these are areas within what's now known as non-coding DNA. So this used to be junk DNA, right? And so we understand now actually that junk DNA does a lot of stuff, and that we were wrong to assume that it's only genes that matter. In fact, there's all sorts of things in there, like genetic switches that control the degree to which a gene expresses itself, right? And expression is really important, because if a gene is turned off or on, or if it expresses really strongly or really weakly, that can totally change an organism, like how long your arm is, or whether you have an arm, right? So these switches are really important. Now, buried in that non-coding DNA, there's some areas that are called highly conserved regions. And these are really important, because if anyone wants to go and look for, say, if you were to look up, if aliens modified us, what would we look for, or where would we look for evidence? Because obviously scientists do ponder this question. Over the years, we've had scientists say, well, could it be that aliens once came here and modified organisms, not necessarily humans, but just, organisms on this planet? And if they did, how would we find the evidence? The conclusion was that if it was in genes, that would be swept away by evolutionary changes, right? It'd be almost impossible to detect that if it was over, say, hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. We just wouldn't see any signs of that. So if there was any deliberate attempt to do it, or even an incidental secondary effect of modification, we would need to look in highly conserved regions, because these are areas that stay very stable over enormous periods. Okay, so that's where we would be looking if we were deliberately looking. And it turns out that in those very same regions, we have these HARs, these human accelerated regions. And the first one that was detected, known as HAR1, obviously, this is really intriguing, because right away they did a contrasting between humans, chimps, and chickens, right? So chickens are very different to us and chimps, right? They've had 300 million years of separate evolution to chimps and us, right? So you compare that segment of DNA, and it's 118 letters long, which is quite short, right? And then you compare it across those two species. What you find is 2 letters have changed. So in other words, every 150 million years, you get a successful mutation in that segment, right? So it's doing something really important. It must be, yeah? Because when it changes, the organism basically dies or can't procreate, yeah? So anytime there's a change, there's been a problem, except for in those 2 instances over 300 million years, where it's been able to either be beneficial or it's just not killed the organism, right? So it's like, well, okay, let's have a look. Let's see what's the contrast with humans then. So if you take the chimp and the human, who have about 7-8 million years distinct evolution, right? You expect to find no difference because you haven't had 150 million years to do it. So there should be no difference. What they found instead was 18 letters had changed, right? So 18 letters, just unbelievably different, completely different, not what they expected. So the lady who found this, she actually created a program to calculate the odds of it because she was a biostatistician, fortunately enough. So she wrote a program to calculate this. And what they concluded was there was basically a close to 0% chance that this could have occurred by any known understood evolutionary mechanisms. And to this day, the conversation in that field is still that they don't know how these have occurred, right? Just to clarify that. They still don't know how these occurred. And we've now found several hundred of them. And rather than being very random, nearly all of the ones that are currently understood are to do with fetal brain development. And they so in other words, the formation of your brain during the fetal stage, right? That's where these things all are active, and they all seem to be doing with that, with the brain development, right? And so there's a few, you'll find some papers out there, well, not just papers, magazine articles that ask, are HARs what make us human? Are they what differentiates from the other primates? Right, so that's
so Bruce, how do you think that this has actually happened then? Do you think that some microbes have come in on these tektites, or do you think that a craft has come down and basically they've genetically altered the what was already here? Is that where you are with this?
I would say that this has to be done more like lab setting. This is more like somebody or something that understands DNA to an astonishing level. That is almost, I always say, like played the music of DNA like notes on a piano, that knows it backwards. Because these are areas, if we were to tamper with one, we're now starting to do, the genetic revolution, but we have not scratched the surface of these regions. We do not understand this non-coding DNA almost at all. It's highly mysterious. And in fact, most of these HRs, we have no idea what they do. So I don't find it probable that, say, like a bacterial, say a panspermia event, like a virus comes in and makes such selective changes that just the brain, almost all of it, the brain. Again, that wouldn't seem to be natural. Like, you could put viral infections back into the camp of kind of almost like a random, you just make sort of random evolution. Yes, they happen, and retroviruses can carry new material, new data into organisms and change them. That definitely is a significant part of evolution. We understand now today that has occurred many times, but this is so hyper specific. And again, why hasn't it happened in the chimps? Why hasn't it happened in other animals? Why is it only in us that these brain genes have been changed, right? So if this is, a virus that's, let's say, has come in from space and rained down on all organisms, infecting loads of organisms, right? How does it end up only giving us these selective changes in the brain? So I would say there's too many indicators that this is deliberate. This is like lab setting, that we're going to modify the brain of this organism, and we're going to shunt it into a permanent childhood, which is basically going to give it all these adaptive abilities to stay mentally flexible, to learn new skills, and to be able to be completely unlike all the other primates on this planet. Right. And there's another reason why I say this again, is that if we look at chromosome 2, and this is another issue, that all primates on this planet, have 48 chromosomes. And as far as we understand it, all archaic hominins would have had 48 chromosomes, right? Today, all humans, bar some with some rare genetic problems, have 46 chromosomes. So what's happened there? So we've somehow got this strange fusion event that marks us different from all other primates and hominins. And so there was, over the years, there's been a few different researchers who've touched on this. I mean, most famous probably Lloyd Pye, who wrote on this, saying that, that he thought that this was a deliberate alien engineering event, right? And if you look closer into it, unfortunately, because Lloyd's passed on and, he hasn't lived to see this, I'd say the genetic revolution in its true heights, that we now can look and see what's been going on there, and we also date it better. And it turns out, so at the fusion site, we have an active gene. First of all, that's kind of odd that it's fused on an active gene, but this gene is to do with reproduction, the immune system, and also a reproductive system, right? Again, key areas you might want to get at if you're modifying an organism. Right? And then around the site, there's also additions and deletions of information. So looking like There's been some meddling around the actual fusion site. And this, when you look at the conventional discussion of this, they say, well, okay, like how can you end up with a total replacement? Total replacement. All the other humans gone. Just the ones that had this rare, random mutation have survived. Now, that's a glaring anomaly in itself. And so the theory that's offered is that, well, not even a theory, but the tentative explanations say that, first of all, it suggests that whatever changes came about because of this fusion, they offered such profound adaptive abilities, such profound positives, that this sort of new human could outcompete all other hominins on the planet. So it had to be something amazing to retain it in that way. That it wasn't just swept away by evolution, right? Secondly, it has to be really occurring in a group where there's others that have it, because otherwise it's going to be recessive, right? It's just going to disappear. You're going to have, you're going to have one person with it, rare mutation. They're going to mate in a group that don't have it, and it's just going to disappear, right? Probably in one generation. Yeah.
So there are changes, though. There are differences, aren't there? I mean, have you looked at like Rh negative blood, that side of things at all in your hypothesis?
I have, but I'm not. I don't find it. There's no reason why I don't find that like convincing. The stuff, the idea about the blood types relating to alien modification is because we just don't know even which blood type was first. So there's no foundation to start from. Right, because if we don't know which is the original, untampered blood type, then we've got no way of knowing which one would come out of modification. Do you see what I mean? So we're not even at a point where we can begin that. But I know a lot of people sort of feel that perhaps Rh negative, O negative blood, or Rh negative blood have all these differences that suggest some tampering. And so, it could be true, but then there's a few other problems with that as well, which very quickly, because I know I want to sort of tackle the other stuff, but just very quickly, you've got to consider that you can be Rh negative, but your parents can both be Rh positive, right? So the idea that you're in some sort of unbroken, right?
You're right.
So the idea you're in some sort of special, different group doesn't make sense if your parents weren't in it, but they're your parents. Do you know what I mean? So, but I'm the only one out of the family in that lineage, but you came from those two people. Yeah, do you see what I mean? So you've instantly got a problem where that doesn't make sense that you're of a special bloodline and they're not, but they're your parents and they're your bloodline. So I always think so when people put that to me, that's it. I think it's that ends that entire theory and cancels several books that are out there just with that, right? And the people haven't, I don't know why the writers of those books should have really thought that through a bit more carefully. But you also do definitely need to also as well, people need to understand as well that when we talk about Rh negative, first of all, there's a couple other things out there that I'll just quickly tackle this while we're on the topic, because I know a lot of people are interested in this, right? That you got to think about it. That one of the confusions is that it's to do with rhesus monkeys, right? Which is not. The only reason why it's called Rh for rhesus is because a similar kind of antigen was first discovered in rhesus monkeys, right? It's not the same one that we have. We are not related to rhesus monkeys, not in any meaningful way. That yes, they share a very distant ancestor with us, like I don't know, hundreds of million years ago, right? But people say, oh, it's from rhesus monkeys. Like no, the rhesus monkey has a similar antigen, right? But that's why we call it that. The other thing is that it's not that we don't have any of those antigens. It's that there's one that is missing, right? There's just one of these antigens that you don't have, and that categorizes you as rhesus negative. There's people with much stranger and more unique blood types than that. There's one type called the golden blood. And if people want to see a really weird blood type, look up the golden blood, because these people have none of those antigens. And that was thought to be totally impossible, right? And there's only, I think, maybe like a dozen of these people alive on the planet. So, if you're going to go with, there's maybe a special kind of people out there with special
I've
blood,
never heard of that one.
Like,
that's interesting.
Right. Yeah. So that's who I would say that people should look a bit closer at, is the people with the golden blood, because that is just a super weird blood type. And it's so rare. And there's a lot of like really rare blood types that people don't focus on when they talk about stuff like Rh negative and blood types, right? So if anything, you'd be looking for I would say, extremely rare blood types rather than what is really a super common blood type, Rh negative.
Can you tell us anything about the FOXP2 protein sequence and what the research Gary Nolan has been doing with it?
Yeah, FOXP2 is one of those I have looked at in terms of this research, because that seems to have a mutation that's around the same time as this formation of the brain, around the 780-ish thousand years ago, there's indications of one of the changes. There's been a couple of different changes to FOXP2. Like we have a slightly different version to Neanderthals, for example. But one of the key variants appears at the beginning of our kind of Homo sapiens lineage. And that gives us, it's related to speech. I mean, I don't think on its own it's a speech gene, but it's been related to speech and definitely to, brain function. There's a number of others. I mean, there's one that's quite one, RGAP2B as well, which is important to the brain, which again, I think RGAP2B is the one that they recently injected into monkeys, implanted into monkeys' genomes, and that and it caused the monkey's brain to grow bigger and also to develop a more human-like structure. So again, we are experimenting with some of these same genes today, but that's one of the ones I identify as well from the beginning of this lineage. And there is another, and I think I'm trying to think the other one, but there's these two that I mentioned in the book with RGAP2B and another one where one of them, I might have them the wrong way. So I'm not sure if it's RGAP2B or the other one, but there's one that is described as having appeared fully formed out of non-coding DNA. And it's a crucial brain gene in humans. So you've got to think of that in the context. So it just magically appears fully formed out of the mess of non-coding DNA. And it's a crucial brain gene, right? And there's another one which is described as being, it appears to be like a fragment of a longer gene that has almost been cut out, Xeroxed and put back in, is the way they describe it. Their words, like Xerox. So they're seeing things that look like things we do, right? That you've got a segment that looks like it's cut out, replicated, added on to the original gene, which boosts, I think it's the neocortex, right? And again, I say RGAP2B, a crucial brain structure gene that appears. And then you've got there's a clustering of these genes around about the beginnings of our lineage. And we know that because apart from dating when some of these genes appeared is not super accurate. There's usually a date range, so they say around 1 million years ago, or around 1 million to 800,000 years ago, or something like that. But we know that the brain is going into a new form around 800,000 years ago because of the fossil record, right? That we find that if you look at the fossils or ancestors going from then on, there's basically a huge cranial capacity increase, which is considered a mystery that occurs from 800,000 years onwards. And that was long known as a mystery before we had the DNA evidence. And it was for what could have caused it. Was it because we started cooking meat or, what was going on? Nobody really knew. But now that we have the DNA evidence, we start to see actually there's a whole slew of genomic, changes going on. And that there's several of them are brain genes that are mysterious. And then you've got the HARs, these human accelerated regions in the non-coding DNA. So now you've got, look, a fused chromosome. And we know that fused chromosome, that occurs at the start of this lineage because it's found in Denisovans, Neanderthals, and us, right? So, and we know that we share a common ancestor. So it has to have occurred before the split, and then when a biologist kind of looked a bit closer into this, when did it go back to chimps or did it happen more recently? By looking at when the telomeres fused, which is the ends of the chromosomes, he deduced it was somewhere around 750,000 years ago, give or take, right? So in other words, you're back at that beginning of the split of the Neanderthals, Denisovans of us. So it's happening around then. So you've got now a fused chromosome with weird aspects to it, and which gives us huge benefits and a total replacement of all other humans. We've got the human accelerated regions, inexplicable rapid evolution in non-coding areas that are responsible for genetic expression, so how much our genes express. And now we also have anomalous genes and gene fragments that are crucial to the brain. So when you start putting those bits together, you're like, what is going on here? And, why isn't this in any other organism? Again, if this was panspermia or some other extraordinary thing, why is it only happening in us? Why isn't it happening in other animals? I mean, bear in mind that we were very similar to the other primates and the other hominins. Why is it just happening in us?
You're making a lot of sense, Bruce. You're making a lot of sense, mate. Go ask your next question, Dave, because I've more or less got an answer to my next question earlier. So carry on.
Well, I'm not quite sure where to take it. I would like to come full circle and plainly ask you again, like I did at the start, what do you think happened to our planet 788,000 years ago? Some sort of cosmic war or something like that? And I can't help but think of Joseph Farrell's work. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Only a little. I mean, I'm very little. Yeah. I mean, is it about the war of is that War of Gods type stuff, isn't it? Or
cosmic war, between Mars and Earth,
yeah. I mean, look, the way, I mean, look, there's two ways to look at this. If I was to just argue on the basis of the evidence that we had, and this is just for a moment, putting aside why I was doing this research, which I'll clarify, but if just based on the evidence we have, I'd say, well, look, you've got this enormous crystalline object that comes here. It comes here, 788,000 years ago. It's made of this type of stuff we expect to see in an advanced alien megastructure, like, in a Bracewell probe type object. So I think that's reasonably what we're dealing with. And then right at that same time, we have not only obviously all these other cosmic events, which I think almost like a reshaping of the planet, asteroids hitting it, objects hitting it, this magnetic field disruption, all this strange stuff going on. And that we now see, and then all these genetic changes in one organism out of this whole range of menagerie of creatures here that, to me, it suggests that something on that object came down. Now, with that evidence alone, I couldn't tell you whether it was an Iceman, like, the Aboriginal stories, or whether it was a robot, in that respect, if you were just to look at it, you couldn't say because you wouldn't know. There's nothing that's remained of whatever came down. But you could say either it sent down robots, nanobots, or, people in a ship, whatever it was, something came down, selected an organism, an early hominin, modified it essentially in like a lab conditions, to make a new kind of human, and that human was almost certainly modified in such a way, what we call now genetic gene drives, which is basically where that organism is created so that no matter which other human or early archaic human it mated with, right, you would get two sets of the new DNA information, not one from the other hominin and one from this one. I think it was overwriting them, so that's why you get this replacement. So we understand that kind of technology today because that's being done. Like Bill Gates is doing that with mosquitoes, right? That the modified mosquitoes information overwrites the partner and in the child, right? And so you just get the new kind. I suspect something like that was done. But so just based on the evidence, I wouldn't know what it was that came down, but something came down and seems to have done things that we understand. But if you were to go to the side of this, which is why was I doing this in the first place, which is why, this is because, I had heard of an account by two people in particular. There's an Aboriginal elder called Jerry Bostock and a lady, an Australian lady called Valerie Barrow, who had what they claim to be a kind of an experience, like say a high strangeness experience with an ancient Aboriginal artifact called a Chiringa. Now, the Chiringa mythology and lore is that these are small, essentially handheld kind of, so relatively small objects that are considered highly sacred, and that as far as I understand, they are sacred to about 3 or 4 different nations around the Uluru region, and that they are said to have been left here in the creation time, the Alchiringa time, and by the Alchiringa beings, and that they contain a consciousness, that they are living artifacts, that are receptacles of knowledge and information, and that can only really be brought out by the high elders, the kind of the clever fellows, during ceremonial settings, and that, basically have all this wisdom and knowledge in them, right? And so normally, average people, anyone wouldn't really have access to these. But the backstory was that one of them had apparently been stolen from a cave by Europeans about a century ago or more, had been found in a cave, and that there was a lady trying to get this thing back to its traditional setting. Now, I don't know if this lady was aware of exactly what it was, just it was a sacred artifact and she was trying to get it back to the people at Uluru. And it was temporarily left with Valerie Barrow, who shortly afterward started to have experiences, downloads, this information appearing in her head, being told that this was a living artifact, it was an Alchiringa being, and that it was giving her this whole lost history of humanity. Now, a lot of people say, well, okay, maybe she just went crazy or, whatever. A couple of days later, this elder was traveling with a friend of hers in a car near her house. And she mentioned, I've got a friend lives down this road in a house called Alchiringa. And he says, take me there. I want to go there. So turns up her house. You can think, you've just had this like an ancient Aboriginal artifact left to your house. She said she's never had any interactions with Indigenous people, right, in the years of living there. And now an elder's turned up at your house, right? And so he comes in. So after a little while, she gets the feeling like he knows. And she says, look, yeah, I've got this thing here, but it's in the other room and it's in a box and I don't touch it. And, it's because she understands you're not supposed to touch these things and look on them, right? They're sacred objects. And so he's like, it's men's business. So basically, women aren't supposed to touch them at all or even be near them, right? So and she's like, if you want it, you can take it. So he's like, no, doesn't want to do with it, because he understands that these things are power objects that come with a lot of, trouble, really. So indigenous people are wary of very powerful objects, and anything that's going to come with all that kind of trouble. So but he tells her, look, I think you're supposed to take this to a spot called Gosford, the Carryong, like Gosford glyphs, if anyone's familiar with that. There's some what looks like Egyptian writing on some walls down at Gosford in New South Wales, Australia. There's also an Aboriginal site there. I think there's a men's site and a women's site, ceremonial sites. Like it's overlooking the bay down at Broken Bay, if people are sort of familiar with New South Wales. And so he says, we'll go there in a few days' time. And so they went there, and when they were there, they had a shared kind of collective time slip type experience, which they describe as, one moment they were kind of there, and they were at the site with these rocky outcrop with some engravings in it. And then they said the next thing, they were looking down at the bay, and they could see a crashed flying saucer in the water and another one hovering above it, taking beings out of the water. And that then when they started to look at each other, they realized they no longer appeared to be humans. And they were getting information the whole time about this event, that there had been a craft had arrived here from the Pleiades through a gateway, that this craft was a silica ship that had been grown. It wasn't made, it grew in a matrix, and it was a living AI ship, that it arrived here and had been destroyed, that some ships had escaped and had come down, and they had crashed. Obviously one had crashed to Gosford. In fact, Jerry remembered that he was the pilot in that lifetime, that he was the pilot of the ship in the water, and that he had drowned in the water. They then start to get all this other information about why it happened, a whole kind of full download. Now, people said to me, is that a past life? Is it something else? I don't know, because you could argue this in different ways, right? It could be that they had a past life and this triggered a recall. It could be the technology is just projecting this whole story to their heads, right? Yeah. Or it could be something else. And again, with mysterious events, I always think that there's usually 2 or 3 mind-bending possibilities, right? But the bottom line is, if it was real, because obviously she wrote up a book about her experiences, and it goes on. I don't want to drag out too long, because the book includes more of these experiences they had, other people that also remembered events, because they met other people who said, I remember being on the ship. And in the end, I think there's about 40 different people that are connected to her story. So this isn't just 2 people saying it. They ended up in encounters with dozens of other people who'd turn up or come to her and say, I remember stuff from this. And so in the end, you end up with this whole kind of complete narrative. Now, I was interested, and I thought, well, look, it's astonishing. It involves Aboriginal elder, obviously other Western sort of people, so a bit of both. Also, different interpretations available to it, more metaphysical, more scientific. But I thought, well, what'd be interesting is there any evidence that this is real? Because, we've all heard of downloads and channeling and, abduction narratives and people getting told things that happened in the past or told that things are going to happen in the future. But the usual thread is that none of them have any good evidence. Right. That's the bit that always is disappointing, is we get these amazing accounts from people and we're like, God, if only there was just some tangible evidence that we could say this seems to be real. And I thought this had the potential for that, because it was dealing with events on such a big scale, like a massive object blowing up in orbit, dripping melted crystal across the land, it's sort of described in there. The engineering of the first Homo sapiens is described. A multi-directional bombardment deliberately done by extraterrestrials with asteroids thrown at the planet. That's described in there. So I'm thinking, well, these are events on such a big scale that they might leave a trace in the geological records, right? Obviously I can't find the bones of the extraterrestrials who landed or something like that. It's too long. Well, maybe they're out there, but I have no way to do that, right? So if they're one they stumbled on, great. But what you can do is look in the existing scientific papers to see if there's anything like that that's happened. And so you can probably imagine, I was astonished when I looked into it and found this australite tektite mystery. There's a 160 years long mystery of what seems to be a giant silica object breaking up and melting, and leaving this debris all across, a 10,000 kilometer path. And that, all these scientists have been arguing over for decades. I mean, quite honestly, I'd never heard of it. So it wasn't like, I'm going to cherry pick something out. I didn't even know if I would find anything that matched that description. And then the fact that this multi-directional bombardment, that was only discovered in 2016. Because initially I was thinking, look, if that was real, surely we would have all heard of it, right? Because you think multi-directional bombardment of Earth, that's massive. Why haven't we learned that in school or something, right?
It needed to happen in 1940, Bruce. That's the problem, not 780,000 years ago.
Yeah,
we might have heard of it.
Well, but you know what I mean. You do think
if they'd let it slip out,
somewhere in the Nat Geo that you would have seen some Nat Geo special about that time when all these asteroids hit Earth. But the reason why is because quite simply, it hadn't been detected. It was only in 2016 a German geological team uncovered evidence of a multi-directional bombardment, and so it's a very new discovery. And keep in mind that the book that I'm utilizing, I have talked to Valerie as well. Unfortunately, Jerry has passed on, but the book I was utilizing at its core is published in 2002 or 2003 from events in the 1990s. Okay, so she didn't know anything about this multi-directional bombardment. So if anyone says, well, couldn't someone build a story around this stuff? Well, that's problematic. For a start, she never mentions australites. It's never come up in her her life. She had not heard of them. The asteroid bombardment hadn't even been detected when she wrote about it. And at the time of writing, Homo sapiens were argued to have arisen about 500,000 years ago.
And so the location is correct as well.
Right, and the location in Australia, and that they came down in Australia. And it just so happens where the tektite buttons are is South Australia, right? New South Wales and stuff, right? So it's coming down in the same area where these ships have come down, right? So it's like if you were coming straight down, you end up there. But it's kind of weird that the concordance that is in the place, that you've got this material there. And it also, I argue, for a number of reasons in my other book, My Forgotten Exodus, which people read that, I explain why I kind of zero in on Australia for human origins as well. There's a lot of additional.
The Bracewell probe sounds like the what's the satellite that's supposed to be going around Earth? They're supposed to have been here for thousands of years. The
Black Knight.
Yeah. I mean,
very similar.
Black,
very similar idea, and I don't dismiss the Black Knight satellite at all. I mean, I think that there is the potential for there to be multiple probes in our solar system monitoring us from various civilizations. And again, this isn't woo-woo stuff, because if people look into this, there's been a number of scientists that have been recently questioning this, that shouldn't we be looking at, say, near Earth bodies, asteroids that may be circling, the sun, sort of not far from us, that could be housing sort of sentinel probes, and also could they be sitting on the lunar surface or elsewhere, or looking like asteroids out in the asteroid belt but monitoring us. So there could in fact be many such objects, right?
I've had it hinted to me by certain scientists, who will mention the name, that there are satellites that are going up that are looking at other satellites that are not from Earth.
Totally plausible. I think we should sort of expect it in a way. Again, with the kind of the current view is that it's a paradox that we don't see aliens, right? It's a paradox that we don't see lots of evidence of alien technology and stuff. So it's not really shocking if you find it. If you think about it, really, the shock has been that we didn't find it, because initially it was thought that there was aliens on Mars, aliens out there everywhere, and then the surprise was when we started to be able to look, is they didn't immediately find it. It looked like Mars was barren. The lunar surface was pretty barren. We didn't find spaceships just flying around. So it was like, oh, where are they all? Now that
we're looking at each other, mate. We're looking at each other in the DNA.
Exactly. Look, they could. Well, that's firstly, and they could simply be monitors. And again, they've written off the idea that they could be on Earth's surface. If you look, they said, what about on Earth's surface? Well, we wouldn't find anything because the geology of Earth isn't very good at preserving such evidence over a long time, whereas the lunar surface has remained fairly undisturbed. Occasionally there's impact, but they expect, say if something crashed on the lunar surface, it's almost just should be sort of pristinely preserved. So they're tending to focus on the moon and Mars. But that, I think, is a shame, because if you really think about it, like if you were to explore our solar system anytime since the death of Mars, right, then where are you going to explore? Where are you going to explore? You're going to go to this planet that has a biosphere, right? So yes, the moon's fine and Mars is interesting, but surely anyone that's exploring our solar system, what's going to interest them is the one planet with a biosphere, right? Because there's barren rocks everywhere. Who cares? There must be a point for a galactic civilization where how interested are you in yet another barren rock that you go past, right? That's not very interesting, right?
Let's crack on with this then, Dave, because we're getting through the time. Sure. I'm noticing we're hour and a half in here.
Yeah, no worries.
What I find most interesting about your hypotheses, Bruce, is how you derived your research list from this story of the Alcheringa stone, and how you've managed, for instance, provide evidence supporting claim that ET beings could possess technologies capable of traveling across the universe and even time. So you've methodically gone through these questions and pretty much pinpointed the answer. That's what I find very fascinating about this whole story. So what do you say to critics regarding things like shamanism and past life regressions and maybe even powerful artifacts?
Yeah, I mean, again, I know that we live in a culture, of course, where all of that is just dismissed as woo, and that it can't be. But then conversely, the very same people often would quote you stuff like, any great advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic, right?
I have that written down. Yeah.
Right? And then often the same scientists and debunkers would use those sort of quotes on Twitter or somewhere, right? But do they really believe it then? Because then when we see magic, it's dismissed as just nonsense, right? So, but if we're looking for advanced beings, shouldn't we be looking for magic, right? So if that's the level of technology that they would have, then why shouldn't they be able to just beam stuff into your head, right? Because even now we're developing the technologies to transmit information into people's heads, right? Voice to skull technologies. So then is it actually weird to have an artifact that's really advanced civilization that would beam its information into your head if even we're doing it, right? And then on top of that, then see like things like time slips. Again, I mean, if you have a species that is so, let's say, understanding consciousness more than us, understands technologies more than us, a lot of these things don't look woo. Like a living ship, I think that we, our cutting edge is saying we probably will make these Bracewell probes to explore the galaxy. So if we see one, is that weird? No, not really. A living ship actually makes sense. AI traveling the universe makes sense. Telepathy, again, if we understand our consciousness now, and obviously I think most of us here, a lot of the people in the community that were listening have probably had telepathic experiences, right? You've had them. They know their friends calling on the phone. I mean, that's a famous, everyone kind of knows that stuff happens to people, or knowing when someone in your family is injured or killed. People know, right? They just know, oh God, something's happened, right? This stuff happens all the time. So we can dismiss it as woo, but it is a constant normal for a wide section of humanity. So I think that there's a time for the critics to just say, hang on a minute, maybe we are limiting, right, the reality that is possible in this universe because it doesn't fit our little comfortable box, not because it's not possible and not because we shouldn't expect it of more advanced beings, because we cannot go around saying that significantly advanced technologies were indistinguishable from magic, and then when we see magic say, oh, what a load of nonsense. I mean, it's not coherent. I think these people, the critics, are not internally coherent, and that they need to actually look at themselves and say, is it just that things aren't meshing up to how I want them to mesh and that it doesn't fit with my little box, rather than that there's any actual scientific limitations on this, or that any of this phenomena doesn't mesh with what we would expect from an extraterrestrial. And I think contact, and again, the experience, people that come experiencers, people that are having the experiences, if there is something out there or even nearby trying to make contact, there's no reason to think its kind of contact would be, pick up the phone and call us or land outside the White House. Why couldn't its mode be so alien, so weird as to be that it just starts doing stuff, odd things to millions of people, contacting them in its own way, doing stuff in their heads, doing things in their lives, really weird stuff. Because if you look at even organisms on this planet, a lot of them communicate through smell, through color, through giving off pheromones, movement, electricity, light, right? So we want them to do what we do. And even on our own planet, most organisms don't do what we do, right? They communicate in super weird ways that we barely comprehend. And we want an alien to do what we do and just land and say, hello, I'm Bob from Mars. And it's, when you think about it, it's totally mad. The thing we're sold as being normal is totally mad thinking.
Well, based on that, then, Bruce, what are your thoughts on people's perceptions being altered by the phenomenon, and how is that being achieved? Are the objects manifesting as things that we've been thinking about? So it means they can hack our brains and maybe implant false memories, blank events, and maybe offer up a false reality. Do you think that's happening?
I do think that's happening. I know very briefly in the book I touch on that with the case in Hawaii where there was a guy using brain analysis type software. People were coming in and saying that they had alien abduction experiences, right, and that they were having problems. So he treated it as a health issue, and he scanned their brains, and he tried to work out what was going on, and he found signs of anomalies in the area of the brain that processes visual and auditory information, that almost like a sort of almost like a neural scarring. There was some sort of anomaly in that region. Now, if something was hacking in to your brain and feeding you visual and auditory information, right, and it leaves a kind of a mark, then that's what we might expect. And if it's doing that, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that from your objective reality. Because you think about it, if there's some sort of technology or even an organism that just by default can do that, that has the power to hack into other brains, right, then it could feed you these kind of abduction experiences and other, contact events. All these things people are reporting could be achieved either by some natural telepathic mechanism or a technology that hacks into your brain, feeds you a 3D VR scenario where you are now there with the being and it's communicating with you. And if you start to look at it in that light, people should really rethink just dismissing these experiencer accounts. And I think this is probably something we'll be able to do in 100 years or so, or maybe less, that we might be able to do that.
How some people are able to see these things and other people who are stood next to them see nothing. The one person's being blanked, the other person's being allowed to see, or they've got some sort of vision they're able to see because their chemistry is slightly different, and that's what explains experiences, perhaps. Who knows?
Absolutely, that they could be choosing people based on some anomaly you have, or it could be that some anomaly you have allows you to see them, so it may be incidental or it may be deliberate, but there's a lot of reports like that. And I spoke to a guy the other day and he said, he could see like a weird black helicopter just not far above him, like a couple of floors of a building higher. And he said, and no one else around him could see it. He said, nobody was reacting. And he was like, how can they not see this black helicopter that's hovering there? And but he was the only one looking up. So, I doubt it was a helicopter. But, it's whatever he was seeing, that object that he perceives as a helicopter, nobody else could see it. And he said it wasn't, it wasn't like it was miles away. It was quite near. And everyone else was just walking around like there was nothing there. So, again, as those reports come out again and again of people seeing something, sometimes helicopters, sometimes strange spaceships.
Yeah, they like helicopters for some reason. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
My Chinooks are a favorite for some reason.
I think it's because of the hovering, because we'd accept a hovering helicopter more than a hovering plane. I think that's why it fits with them hovering there watching you. So it takes on that form. Now, I don't know whether it's us adapting what we see to make it fit something we can accept, or whether it's something cloaking itself. Which is a really, again, you can go into those mental loops, right? But I think that we need to start looking
Egypt
at that.
on the hieroglyphics. I thought that was interesting. If we're talking time travelers, okay, that fits that side. But is it also that they were using the same manipulation and the same image? Maybe time doesn't mean anything to them. Whoever caused that person to create that hieroglyphic of the helicopter. In Egypt at that time.
Time, we've definitely got a question of what does it mean to them, because obviously it's something that is useful for us in the way of flow of events, but we don't really know how a consciousness from outside of our normal reality would view time, or if it even means anything to them, because again, if it's something that is, say, almost immortal, like an AI, right? Okay, if you have an advanced AI, like that can be essentially immortal, okay, just a big silica moon flying around space, visiting everything, living forever. So its time and our time, perceptions of time would be totally different. If we were to somehow know its mind, it clearly wouldn't experience time like how we do, right? Or it could be that there's something from a higher dimension. Again, I'm not a physicist, but if it's coming from a higher dimension where time literally is flowing differently and it's just popping into our reality, it may look in caveman times, and for it pop out and be doing its stuff for a little while, look in again, and now it's the modern day, because its time is flowing, its experience of time is completely different. So that could be a factor. And again, with wormhole travel, again, I know we haven't got too much longer, but if you think of it, if we have wormhole travel involved, and that's kind of insinuated in this gateway travel that we talked about a little bit earlier on, is that if they've traveled through from the Pleiades, from a gateway is kind of described to come here, which sounds to me like a kind of wormhole travel. That wormhole travel is also a kind of time travel. So could a civilization do stuff like, say, seed a planet, put DNA, bioorganisms on a planet, terraform it, because obviously life terraforms dead worlds, okay, creates a biosphere, and then that same group, not even just the same civilization, but the same group that seeded it, come through a wormhole through time to the present of that same planet, and then inhabit it by using time hole travel. So not just traveling through space, but through time. So coming to the beginning of seeding a world, leaving through its wormhole, and coming back to the present of that same world, now ready to live on, right? So then you think of what would their perception of time be like? Then we'd be thinking, oh, they've been away for billions of years. To them, they've popped in, popped out, come back, and it's ready, right? So some of these are kind of mind-bending concepts, but you think it's plausible within those kind of understandings of the wormholes bending not only space, but they're bending space-time. So they are time travel. If they are using that technology, they are time travelers by default. And in a lot of the contact and in experiences, people are told we are time travelers, or that we have come through the veil of time, not just space. And that, so if those are legitimate contacts from some kind of consciousness that are giving us information, it's interesting that it itself sometimes says it's time traveling phenomena, right? Because that would mesh with that. And it would mesh with a lot of the continuance of the contact phenomena through shamanism up to the present day, that it seems to be a kind of continuum.
Have you got a question, John?
Yeah.
Well, so really, I've only got one more question left. So that I'm really dying to ask. So would you be interested in coming back onto the show with your wife Daniela to discuss your time in the jungles in a bit more depth?
Yeah,
Would
for the
that be
Ecuador
something
stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I will nudge her. She's not always the most comfortable on video and radio, because I'm more of a talker. She's a bit more quiet, but yeah, she's had a lot of extraordinary experiences, and she's a multi-event kind of experiencer, contactee, shaman, psychic medium. So she's had a lot of strange stuff. But yeah, I can get into that, and what we saw in the jungles and stuff. And yeah.
And are there any plans to release Daniela's book in Kindle or audio form? Because I've checked Amazon; it's pretty damn expensive.
Yeah, we have talked about this. We're going to probably try to do a rewrite and update of that material, because some of it is just like not relevant and stuff, but I do think there's a lot in there that we would like to share, like some of her experiences.
Please, Bruce. I need audio. I don't have time for reading books anymore.
I know. I nearly all mine now is just Audible. Yeah, I listen to loads of Audible books. I mean, people have said to me I need to try and get the other one, Forgotten Exodus, onto Audible as well, really, because I know that it kind of, it's difficult though, isn't it? Because I don't have a sound studio myself, and I'd have to sort of go and read it in chunks in a studio. So yeah, it's a difficult one, but I would like to get that on there. But yeah, definitely we should have a chat on that, and she maybe would share some of her own time travel type experiences, which she's had quite a lot. Again, that's
I would love that.
As we touch on in the book.
Let me just ask you this question now, then we'll finish up with this one maybe. Your research, I mean, you're really on top of all this. It's pretty obvious, Bruce, you really are on top of this. You say you're not a scientist, but you've really done the research like a scientist, that's for certain.
I've had to, yeah.
It's really in depth. You spent a huge amount of time getting all this together. Is it now being taken seriously by the scientific community, or are you struggling to get this out there still? I know you've always had a real problem getting people to take this seriously. Have you approached people like, the SCU at all?
I've emailed them a couple of times, never had a response. I've emailed several space scientists, where in some cases I've had like one email back, and then I've emailed them to continue the conversation and not had a reply. Now, I don't know if that's just that they're just really super busy and that they just ignored it, or it's really hard to say. But the overall experience has been a very big negative, because I would understand if it got, if they said, okay, let's have a look at your work, and you send it over and they said, I'm not interested, or even if they never replied, but at least they'd had it, and you could think then, well, they didn't like it, right? But if it never gets to the bit where they say, let's have a look at it, then I don't know what to think about that. It's almost like as soon as you mention, I'm doing this work, it's quite strange, that they don't want a bar of it, and you never hear back. So if you can't have it considered, how do you get anywhere with it, right? So that's been a big problem. The same with journalists, where I've reached out and sometimes it'd be, oh yeah, it sounds interesting. And in a couple of cases that progressed a bit. For example, I think it was Futurism. They were going to write an article about the genetic anomalies that we talked about, like the HARs and stuff. And then they asked the scientist who first discovered HARs, and she obviously was like, well, I don't think they're aliens. And it was like, well, did you expect her to, right? I wouldn't expect her to say that I think it's alien. So then they just sort of, oh, we'll pause it, we're going to look more into us, and they just dropped it. It was like, oh, if the academics are saying it's not aliens, then it's like, well, what did you think they're going to say? That they're just going to go, yep, it's aliens, he's right. So I don't understand that. So there's a strange kind of, and I've tried with the guys with the debrief and stuff as well. They showed initial interest, like 2 or 3 of the journalists, and they never got any further. Again, one of them saying that, oh, I wouldn't know how to handle it because, oh, it's controversial. It's like, but of course it's controversial. So, I mean, this is a problem. I've had different journalists, and recently a couple others I've reached out to who have looked at it a little bit and then just disappeared and stuff. So that's been the continual theme with journalists, is to basically...
It's a huge rabbit hole you're expecting people to jump down. I mean, I'll be honest, you've convinced me. I'm convinced by this. This we've done 1 hour 43 minutes, and it's taken how many years I've been talking to you now? Quite a few years, and I feel I've got my head around this now. What you're trying to show.
It takes talking.
Other people are going to feel the same after watching this interview. You have come across really well, and you've really pushed this well on you as well. And I will. I'm in a group with most of the SCU leadership, and I will make sure they watch this. And I also good friends with Ross Coulthard, Australian. And I think Ross should watch this as well. And I'm going to be making sure that Ross watches this and gives me his feedback for you.
I have sent him the paper, so he has it there. And I don't know if he looked through it, because he hasn't really come back and he did ask a question. I don't know. It was a bit difficult. I don't want to go too into depth, but he sort of asked a question about it. I felt the question was answered by the paper. And the problem again with this is that either you have to have a long conversation with me, like we've had, or you have to read the paper, because it's not something that I can really give to someone, as you can imagine, in a simple email. They said, so what's it about?
Yeah. It's deep,
right? It's deep, isn't it? So there's no way that you can sort of do that. If you can say the elevator pitch, aliens came here in a crystal ship and they made these people, and do you want to hear about it? I can totally understand why that is not effective. So it has to be either let's get on the phone and have a conversation, or it has to be I'll read the paper and then come back with questions. So again, with journalists and scientists, that's a similar problem. Okay, so I'm not going to say it's any one person is better than other. That's the same problem with all of the people that I've contacted, really, is that unless they say let's jump on the phone and talk for at least an hour, right, or they read the paper, because I have got paper and other things, right, you can see why it'd be a struggle, isn't it? Because there's no way to sort of put this.
Well, you've just given us the idiot's guide, mate. You really have. I mean, I was an idiot up until this today. I really have. I mean, I've read up a bit on it today, and I know that you've read the book, Dave. So you're really into this as well. So I'm on your case now, mate. I tell you, I appreciate really will be pushing this for you.
I think you understand now why I have a problem, though, innit? You can see that it is in depth, and it's not something you can sell on Twitter with 3 or 4. So people say to me, "Can you just send me a link?" And I think, because
what do you mean it happened 780,000 years ago? They can't prove Roswell.
Exactly. How can you know that? How can you know it's 785,000 years? All those sort of questions come out, and I kind of understand that, but it is there. But the problem is, again, if I was to send you 100 papers on tektites, would you even want to read that? It'd be totally unreasonable for me to even give that to you. It's almost like if you send me a link, because what they sort of want is one article that's going to explain it all conclusively, when science just doesn't work like that. I'd have to send them dozens of papers, which obviously I put together as links in my paper, like you would, preparing. But if I was to say, is there one link that does it for you? No, because nobody else has ever made that theory, right? So there isn't another link to send you. You'd have to go either through what I've done, or you have to read my paper, which isn't completely tidied, but I will tidy it up and put it out there. But it takes a conversational to go through that paper. And again, I wouldn't, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but I should understand this. I can't invest the time to give each person on Twitter individually all of that, right? So it has to be, that's why I try and contact scientists and journalists or media, because it needs someone to sit there and go, this is what it is, everybody. Not me.
I think you can get some book sales out of this interview. I really do, because it has come across really well. And I think I've more or less understood where you're going with it. So, I mean, hopefully I'm not the only, the only idiot out there. They're going to watch this and they're going to pick up on what you've been saying, and you're going to get some benefit, I think.
Yeah. I appreciate it. And I'm open to questions. Look, anyone who reads the book or listens to one of the interviews like this and they have a question based on that, I'm quite happy to answer it. I'm not, as you know, I'm not shy to answer people on Twitter and stuff. So I don't have that problem. I'm not hiding from anybody's scrutiny or their difficult questions. So if anyone listens and says, I'd really like to know something on that, then I will answer it as well.
I'd like to end by saying I really loved the book from start to finish. I loved how you set out your research list. I love the unorthodox way in which you did that, and I love how you followed through and proved everything you set to prove.
Thank you.
I'd actually like to end with one of my favorite bits from the book. Is from the last chapter. Falsifiable hypotheses can be explored and tested. Alteringa is either an alien intelligence embedded in an ancient artifact, or he never existed. A giant crystalline ship exploded over Australia, leaving debris, or another explanation could be found. The Homo sapiens genome is either rife with strangely modified DNA code, or there is not a scrap to be found. So which is it? That's an extremely paraphrased end of the book, and it sold me.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad as well you had the chance to get through it, and I appreciate that. It's really good.
Bruce, can you let our listeners and our watchers know how they can get in contact with you, where they can find you on Twitter, Facebook, etc., and your website details?
Sure. If someone has a specific question from listening, they can email me at bruce@brucefenton.info. Also, I'm on Facebook. I don't use it very much, but they can look for me again. I've author page and my own page, Bruce R. Fenton. Twitter is down as Exogenesis HH. And again, my direct messages are open if they have a question. And Amazon for the books, they can email me about the books. And if I've got a copy here, I can send it to them direct signed, or otherwise Amazon and any bookshop, you can go in and request. I don't think they'll find it prominently on the shelves, but you can go in and ask if it's there, or order it in bookshops.
Awesome, mate. I really enjoyed this.
Fuck yes, that was great. Yeah, me too. This is a good one. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thanks,
also
Bruce.
Appreciate it.
We'll end
Good
it
talking.
there. That's brilliant.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Thanks,
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cool.